And it is available from Suraj if anyone wants to have this. So we'll have the rules laid out is 30 minutes, so that is 20 minutes. I will give you a sort of a signal, 25 minutes, we should close it, and 5 minutes for discussion. So we'll get going. My namesake, Dr. Pradeep. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you, sir. So let me share the screen. I hope it's visible now.
It is.
Correct. Okay. So I am going to talk today about the cluster analysis of a type of materials at atomic scale. And I start by explaining how we can do it, why this is important, and how this is going to help us understand materials of different kind at different length scales. Okay, so to get started, so my group basically focuses on two type of aspects in metallurgy and material science. One is combinatorial alloy design, the other is correlative microscopy. So basically what we do, the first part I just briefly show you just to know what this means, combinatorial alloy design. We typically utilize different types of techniques to make materials library so as to identify the right kind of materials with the right kind of properties that we can explore in detail. So that means there is a lot of composition space available in the periodic table, and most of the things, even though there are phase diagrams and other things, we may not know all their behavior and performance. So one such method is the combinatorial thin film, where we have multiple sputtering targets and over which we can now create on a substrate a series of compositions as what you see here from different directions. So you get a thin film library of all such compositions, their phases, chemistry, structure, everything. So in one little film like this, you get gradients of compositions, and based on the local mechanical properties, you can go on to investigate in detail. So once we identify certain compositions, we are going to the next level that we can produce them in the bulk form. As you can see, we can melt them and pour them into 5 different molds like this from a single master alloy, which is called rapid alloy prototyping. And we are currently establishing this method at IIT Madras so that we'll be able to produce targets for sputtering. We can produce metals, alloys of any kind for any purposes in reasonably large amounts. So we will be able to produce all these combinations as the way we want, and after getting some information from the thin film approach. So now the second part, which is correlative microscopy, which is also an emerging field in microscopy. This is so crucial because whatever that we produce here, we need to be able to analyze them at different length scales, and we will be able to understand their microstructure evolution. So one of these methods is this, as what you see here. This is something we are already able to do at IIT Madras. So from any bulk sample, we'll be able to make electron transparent thin samples utilizing a dual beam microscope, and using a scanning electron microscope through a STEM imaging, we will be able to get these nanoscale layers. And further, we have made another new method or developed a new technique, which is called transmission Kikuchi diffraction. So the same region as what you see in an SEM STEM, you'll be able to map it for their crystallography. So in this case, you have alternative tetragonal and monoclinic phases, and you can see their microstructure on the top and their phase distribution in the bottom. So that means you are able to get different information from the same analysis volume or same region of your sample. And further, we have developed a method from this scale. We can further go down. You can see here the length scale. It's around 3 micrometer as the scale bar. And from there, we can further go down to the almost atomic level, as what you see here. We can see the layer structures nicely, and as well as the chemical heterogeneity in an atomic scale volume. So the z-axis here stands for nanometers. So this is the technique of atom probe tomography, which enables us to really see individual atoms from a complex material state, and the microstructure we are now able to couple with this transmission Kikuchi diffraction.
So one question that I have is that when you say correlative microscopy, it doesn't necessarily mean electron correlation. It can be photoelectron correlation. It can be photon-electron correlation. I do not know whether this is true or it is only electron microscopy that you're referring to.
No, we can do any such correlation possible. I mean, right now I am showing an example of electron-based and atom-based correlation, but it can be done with photons as well. It is not limited. So it can be for a wide range. Okay, so now this is something is quite unique. The right-hand side is unique to IIT Madras because we are the only institute right now to be able to do this kind of a microscopy. And the left-hand side is going to come in a short while. So now to explain how we are able to do this, because we have this national facility for atom probe tomography. So it came up as a national facility, which is there in our humanities and sciences block. So 8 different partners, including DST, gave the funding to develop this infrastructure. So the first one is the dual beam focus ion beam, where we'll be able to get this microstructure analyzed, phase orientations identified, and produce samples of electron transparency, which can then go into both the middle one, which is the atom probe tomography, and the right hand side one, which is the transmission electron microscope, and to get a microstructure in a transmitted geometry, which is a projector. The in-between one is the atom probe tomography, where we'll be able to see individual atoms being spatially distributed in a small 3-dimensional nanometer scale volume. So this is where the interest lies, because in the bulk scale, when you have few atoms forming a cluster, it may be very difficult to discern this arrangement, and it may be very difficult to understand their local chemistry. And this is where the atom probe tomography is so important. As you see here, you can see individual atoms in a matrix, as well as atoms being clustered in a well-defined shape and well-defined morphology and of varying sizes. All of these things we'll be able to resolve and try to figure out what kind of an ordering is taking place, or it's just a random solute clustering. So all of these comes under the umbrella of National Facility for Atom Probe Tomography, and you can get the more details from this link. So before I move on to distinguish the other type of microscopy like electron-based or other methods with respect to atom probe tomography, I would like to give a brief introduction to what is this tomography and how this is so powerful, and why it has become so necessary to understand atomic scale phenomena. So now if you look at this slide, you have a box with a cylinder, with a sphere, with a conical shape objects, all of these inside. Now, depending on what kind of a microscopy do, typically if you use electron-based microscopy, it's going to start from one side, electrons go through this cube, maybe from the top to bottom or left to right. But at the end of the day, you are going to get a projection image, which is this P, what you see. And all of these structures are going to be projected in the form of either a rectangle, a circle, or a triangle. So we really will not have an idea whether this was cylindrical earlier or rectangular earlier, or is it a spherical or is it a circle earlier. So this is a projected view that you get. So the other form of microscopy which existed is that you can make slices of the same box with all these objects into uniform slices. So you get for each slide one of these projected image in an electron microscope. Now you get multiple slices like this, and then you try to correlate whether this 3-dimensional object was a sphere or a circle. So in that manner, we had a series of tomographic methods available so as to visualize this object in a 3-dimensional way, which was originally a 3-dimensional object. So depending on the lens scale, you can see there are a range of techniques starting from X-ray microscopy and tomography until the electron-based tomography methods. But one standout happens with the atom probe tomography, where you can really go down to the resolution of atomic level. Of course, the analysis volume may be less, but still you'll be able to resolve individual atoms and look at their size, morphology, etc. in 3 dimensions. So one simple example to say this, now if you look at this picture, we may be thinking that there is a sheep and there is possibly a lion standing on top of the sheep. But if you really, or sheep or a goat, let's say. So, but if you really look at the reality, this is how it's going to look like. So we have a reality check when we look at the reciprocal space or the virtual space, and we'll be able to understand that what we see may not be always right, and therefore imaging is always going to be an art and an expertise required to discern what we are able to see in the form of this kind of a shadow with respect to what is actual reality. So therefore the question arises, do we really need atomic scale analysis? So as I shown before, we do really need it, because the most materials that we deal, they are all complex. They can be multi-component, that means too many chemical species are together. They can be nanostructures with various type of material processing, and during the processing there can be partitioning, segregation, phase transformation, all these things can happen. And you can have a complex relationship between the nanostructures evolved and with respect to their properties. So to understand the properties arising out of these nanoscale features, we really need to have this atom probe tomography. So now I briefly explain how the method works, so that it's easy to understand what do we get out of this technique. So in principle, atom probe tomography is a simple technique where you see we need a sample prepared in the form of this hemispherical conical tip, where the tip diameter is somewhere in the range of 50 to 60 nanometers. Then we apply positive potential to this tip and the detector which has a negative biasing. So further, it is now improved that we can even apply laser pulsing together with this positive potential to the tip, so that we can have a controlled evaporation, which means at any given pulse, in addition to the base potential, we are going to evaporate atom by atom from this layer. So from our material of choice, we can now evaporate atom by atom, and each atom based on its atomic mass is going to take its own time to reach the detector. Now this kind of atoms transforming into ions during pulsing and then reaching the detector can be represented in the mass spectrum. So the mass spectrum therefore will tell us, based on the atomic mass, how many of these counts of atoms have arrived at different sequence. So you combine this information, that means the peaks that you see in a mass spectrum is a fingerprint of each chemical species, because each chemical species in the periodic table has its own atomic mass. So with that, we will be able to chemically identify them. And the sequence at which they evaporate all the time is a timer that is being recording with respect to the pulse. Therefore, it's a synchronized evaporation. So you know the time sequence of evaporation and you know the chemical identity. So all that it has been evaporated here, you will be able to reconstruct them in a three-dimensional way. So all this that can be reconstructed and layer by layer can be seen for different chemistry, and we'll be able to measure them locally as well as globally for their compositions. So this means atom probe tomography is basically a time of flight mass spectroscopy working together with ion projection microscopy. So this is how the functioning of atom probe works. You can apply positive potential and you can apply laser pulsing or voltage pulsing, so that you can have this evaporation of atoms in the form of an ion. And each time when an ion hits the detector, we get the X and Y position from the detector, and the time of flight is accurately measured because we know the instant of pulsing and we also know the instant at which it reaches the detector. So with these three information, we'll be able to reconstruct whatever that has been field evaporated here into a three-dimensional form, so that you will be able to get the entire picture of your original material that has been field evaporated into a three-dimensional reconstructed volume, as what you see here, and you can be able to accurately identify the chemical species occupying different regions of your sample. So therefore, this gets very powerful. So now I give you a couple of case studies to explain how this clustering and chemical partitioning at atomic scale can really be studied and how it can be correlated with physical mechanisms. So one such example is a case of an iron-based soft magnet. So most of you might have come across this material. So typically these are wound cores of iron-based material, which is used in transformer cores, or these days also used in surveillance system in most of the shopping malls, where you can have these elements inside, which is magnetically coupled. If you take any object inside which has a decoupled state, if it crosses this barrier, it's going to give a buzzer alarm. So these are quite commonly used material. Now, what is interesting with this material is it's been known for 20 years that these are the most high performing soft magnets that exist right now. So, but the important thing is, if you produce these materials in a typical bulk fashion, their properties are poor. That means their coercivity is one of the threshold value to check their performance. If the coercivity needs to be low, then the material has to be almost in a nanocrystalline state or in a millimeter grain size. So the moment we go into nanocrystalline states, it cannot be produced in a bulk form in a nanocrystalline state. It has to be produced by special methods. So one such method is that this combination of metals can be melted, and this can be made in the form of a thin film. And then once we get in a thin film form, like the ribbons here, you need to anneal them carefully to induce nanocrystals. So therefore, there are a lot of things that has to go right. But what happens atomistically is more important. Anything that goes wrong atomistically will not be able to get the right microstructure, and therefore these properties can shoot up at the order of 10 power 6, as what you see here. And so therefore there is a industrial process going on, and at the same time nanocrystals has to evolve from a combination of elements like this, which is always very, very challenging. So in this material, what is important is that this 1 atomic percentage of copper, which is added intentionally to induce these kind of a crystalline phenomena. So now to understand this 1 atomic percent copper by any method, it's going to be challenging. So I'll tell you that if the material is produced in an amorphous state, you will see here in 3 dimensions, all atoms will be sporadically distributed everywhere. It's random distribution. We will not know which atom is going to play what role, and therefore we need this atom probe tomography. So I give you a glimpse of what we will see. So if you heat this material to create nanocrystals, you'll be able to see copper forming its own clusters, iron and silicon going together. so that it forms the soft magnetic iron silicon nanocrystals. Then you have this remaining boron niobium stabilizing the rest amorphous matrix after they get partitioned. So therefore, there is a clear role of each elements that plays in this material so as to get nanocrystals of iron and silicon evolving in a bulk sample induced primarily by the clustering of these copper atoms. That means 1 atomic percent copper, some fraction stays in the matrix, some fraction goes into the cluster, and therefore we need to know how this cluster evolves as a function of processing. So if you now roughly look, for example, the phase evolution by X-ray diffraction, you will see that around 550 degrees, there is some crystallinity that's going to happen. If you look in TM at 535, there's absolutely nothing that you will see. That means everything is amorphous. You have a halo ring pattern in diffraction, so all looks amorphous. So if you look at 555, you tend to get these little nanocrystals, and the diffraction pattern tells you this can be a DO3 structured nanocrystal, and high resolution you will see these are 5 to 7 nanometers. So now if we need to know from this state to this state a difference of 20 degrees, what has really happened at the atomic scale, it's very hard to discern using this electron microscope. Now remember this condition of 535 where everything looks amorphous. If you now go back and check into the atom probe, you will see as a function of temperature, the initial prepared set copper is homogeneous. So I'm going to show only the copper distribution. Everything is homogeneous. At 535, when every X-ray and TM was showing to be amorphous, you can see there's a high number density of tiny little copper clusters that has formed. So at 555, it starts coarsening, and it keeps on increasing in size. That means coarsening is happening continuously until it reaches a size of around 50-60 nanometers at 745 degrees. So there is a continuous evolution of copper in the form of the clusters, while some of them still remain in the matrix. So these size ranges, as what you see here, they are really, really tiny, and it's very hard to see them by other methods. Of course, we couldn't see them by other methods. So therefore, after you get all these things in atom probe, we can still quantify them as a function of time, and we can see how the evolution has happened. There is a continuous increase in size at the cost of the volume fraction. That means a decrease in volume fraction, increase in size. Now we want to understand across different stages, what is the mechanism that is being playing at this stage. So you can say in stage 1, you can have these atoms. Individually, you can see the copper atoms and these clusters that you see. So that means the matrix is amorphous, but the clusters have already formed. All these atoms of copper are clustering while the matrix is amorphous. Now you can locally check them and see there are locations where there is necking between clusters are happening. And if you zoom in there, there is a bigger cluster here and there are similar size smaller cluster. But these smaller size similar clusters are necking. That means they are in contact somewhere in the bridge, as what you see here. The bigger cluster says isolated. Now this is a very strange case where if you now try to measure the concentration using this little volume and see that at the necking region there is slight higher copper concentration compared to what is there in the matrix, and inside the cluster there is reasonably high copper. So that means clusters are formed and there is a bridge between the similar size cluster even though they are smaller, and the bigger one stays isolated. So this is a very special case of coarsening mechanism which we proposed in this application, which is called the coarsening coagulation necking and coarsening mechanism, which is slightly different than the classical outward ripening. Now, if you look at the later stage, the copper, as we know, is still coarsening in the form of the clusters. So now the entire data set of the higher temperature is being discretized into smaller volume. You can do that with concentration thresholds like this. Now we start to see these iron silicon nanocrystals also in a 3-dimensional form, and the copper clusters which are stuck between them. So now we can locally check their concentrations or statistically as well. And you can see that the 75-35 of typical iron silicon nanocrystal ratio is present, and the amorphous matrix is rich in boron niobium, and then you have these clusters in between. So now the cluster of copper cannot diffuse in a matrix which is already crystalline. So the only way it keeps on growing is by dissolving in the matrix and diffusing individual atoms of copper and then agglomerating in a bigger copper cluster. So this is a typical Ostwald ripening that has been known for ages. So you can now distinguish the mechanisms playing in this material at different temperatures.
So 20 minutes.
So yeah, sure. So now the same thing, if you try to image with TM, it is a high resolution aberration corrected microscopy. You can see here, even if you do this ChemiStem, which is the latest advanced TM that we tried, you can now see the copper distribution is quite sporadic. So it's not like an individual cluster in a 3-dimensional form that you are able to identify here. So further with the atom probe, what we can do to understand whether the cluster is crystalline or amorphous, we can still do further analysis, which is called spatial distribution mapping. So I take the stage one single copper cluster here, atoms forming a cluster here. And if you see their distribution, there is no coherency. That means there is no crystal structure evolution at that stage, even though copper atoms are coming together in a matrix to form a cluster. But in stage 3, at a slightly coarsened state, you can now do the same analysis, and then you can see a periodicity of atomic arrangement happening. Now you will be able to discern that there is a interplanar spacing of 2 angstrom between each layers, and then you can say this could be an FCC copper cluster with 3.6 angstrom. So the only other complementary method by which we can do this is called a field line microscopy, where the same atom probe tip can go into it, and you will be able to image the atoms individually on the surface. And this is the only method available where you can image individual atoms. So this is a technique which we are going to build at IIT Madras thanks to the IOE funding, and therefore we'll be able to now look at the crystallography and individual atoms as they are in an amorphous matrix as well as in a crystalline region. So further, we can take the same atom probe data, and then which is called a field desorption imaging. And now you get this detected image from the atom probe, and you can overlay with the stereographic projection and try to identify the individual copper clusters and their correlation with the crystallography. Okay, so this is one example where you can now look at the atoms clustering and their crystallography. The similar stuff we have done for other materials. So this is a thin film ceramic, and you can see that there are nanocrystalline columnar grains of thin film, and it has been prepared by dual beam focus-on beam. If you do the high resolution chemical mapping, you can see these special V-type defects, characteristic defects of thin film, but there is some silicon segregation that you can notice, but there is nothing more that you can really take out of this. So if you do the same thing in the form of a needle with the atom probe geometry, atom probe sample geometry, and the same chemical analysis tells you that there is some silicon enrichment that's happening within these atom probe needles. But this now indicates that it's a stronger segregation than what we saw earlier. If you do the same thing in atom probe, you will see that there are much elongated and thicker precipitates of different types. That means cluster of certain atoms are forming in a defined geometry. And now we will be able to independently look into the chemistry of, for example, the first precipitate, which is broader, and the second cluster precipitate, which is a little bit shorter and a little bit thinner in width. And you will be able to distinguish them for their chemical stoichiometry using this atom probe tomography once the cluster has formed. So that means when we have this typical sample preparation made for microscopy, you can have different types of artifacts. So the electron microscopy based techniques always have this kind of artifacts where some regions may be preferentially dissolved during processing. And this is something, an example that tells us that if you really do three-dimensional analysis in tomography with atom probe, we'll be able to capture all of these included atomic scale phenomena, including the clusters and precipitates captured. And this is an example where you see a lot of precipitate type structures in electron microscopy, but the chemistry looks like there's nothing there. So it looks like a hollow. But the same region you look in atom probe, there is a significant amount of clusters that are visible. So this brings to the last part, which is called correlative microscopy, because if you rely on one technique, we may miss out on the information. That's what we have seen. So this is a method what we have developed, that in a conventional SEM geometry, you can have a sample at 90 degrees, you tilt it at 70, you can use the same electron beam to get a diffraction pattern, which is called the Kikuchi diffraction in electron backscatter diffraction. Now what we have done, if you identify a region of interest, we make it in the form of a thin sample, do the same diffraction, but like a TM, you will be able to image the transmitted image in like a TM, but we are all doing this in SEM. And the diffracted beam is still collected with this EBS detector. So we get what is called transmission Kikuchi diffraction. So this means in a correlative manner. Now this is a grain boundary of an additive manufactured sample with a lot of precipitates inside. If you look at this in TM, this is what you see. Now if you look the same in our SEM stem, you can see much larger field of view, same grain boundary, same precipitate, but with much more contrast and higher statistics. Same thing you do with the diffraction, with this transmission Kikuchi diffraction, same region you can now get the orientation information as well as the phase information. So with that, we now correlate everything. So finally, you see nanoscale precipitates, clusters, everything there. If you go to atom probe, then you see them for chemically resolved, and then you'll be able to say what kind of a precipitate existed. Okay, so my last example before I conclude is one of the collaboration with Professor M.S. Rao in physics, where we try to look at the diamond structures and see if there are vacancy sites in diamond. So this is a 110 orientation of a diamond being resolved in high resolution electron microscopy. And you can see these hexagonal shaped structures where nitrogen implantation can replace some atoms. So you can see there is a breaking bond and there is an atom missing. But if you now want to get the chemistry to know if this is really NV center, then we did recently atom probe tomography, and you can see here there is nitrogen distribution, and these atoms of nitrogen are clustering at certain defect sites, and you can now see them in 3 dimensions and resolve them locally and see what is the concentration of nitrogen at different defect sites and how these nitrogen atoms try to cluster, and we can now get their concentrations at the atomic scale as well. So therefore, I conclude here that the future of microscopy relies on correlated methods. So this is the microscope that we are going to build at IIT Madras thanks to the IOE funding, which is called field ion microscopy. So when we do this, the same sample of atom probe can be imaged, and you get these individual atomic positions imaged. And the same thing can therefore be looked into atom probe and correlated for crystallography as well as chemistry. We will be able to look at even the local bonding structures, and therefore we'll be able to completely understand materials which can form clusters, which can be isolated, or any different types that can exist. So with that, I'd like to stop here, and thank you for your patience. If you have any questions, I'll be glad to take it forward.
Very nice. I mean, nice. You have consumed about 27 minutes, so we have 3 minutes for questions. Let me ask one quick question, and then with that, we can move on. Well, very nice to see all these correlations to get detailed chemical, structural information. Now comes what is next is probably at that point in space, can you get properties?
Yes, so that is
that's the next phase of that. And so how correlative these microscopies with property information, what stage is that, and how do we proceed?
So in this microscope, what we are building, since it's so customized, the stage what we have, the blue one, what is it's a cryogenic stage. So on top of the stage, we are now trying to fit a local, let's say, a tensile testing stage or indentation stage. That means we'll have the sample here. When we are imaging, at the same time, we'll be able to heat them. We'll be able to deform them. That means you push them, because once you get the image, you know the sample is still alive. So that means you can now make a slow deformation at any given load or anything else, and you see the response of the deformation on the structure. Similarly, you can now apply at a later stage, for example, laser pulsing, and see if that little species of the sample is showing reflectivity or any other optical behavior. At the same time, you are imaging those atomic configurations. So you know that what is the atomic configuration existing and how this configuration responds to the external stimulus, that can be load, that can be bending, that can be force, or that can be light or any other thing. So that means you get a rough indication.
It can be magnetism, it can be electrical conductivity, it can be all that as well.
Anything.
So that is where that's where many of our interests lie at the nanoscale. What properties are there? Are there other questions? In the interest of time, let me take other questions. And go ahead, please unmute and then ask your question. Well, people are not asking, so let me just ask you that this also means that there's quite a bit of computation and computational possibilities are there, and that is where a large number of inputs are probably required.
Correct. So this is either way. So from the atom probe data, we know conditions where clusters can happen, and what is the minimum distance between clusters, what is the size at given condition. So it is like we can give an input in order to develop, for example, an ab initio based supercell structure. So the structure, you can take it from the atom probe data, or you assume a structure, do the calculation, find the lowest energy, and fit that structure with the chemical distribution that we got in an atom probe. So we can revalidate both the things so that we can start the computation at the atomic scale with an informed chemical distribution from an atom probe. Together, when we build a field ion microscope, it's getting much more accurate than the atom probe. So you can start your calculation or theoretical study based on the configuration of atoms that we can provide from experiments. Later on, they can build it up because this is a configuration that is existing, which we know it's in equilibrium, so lowest energy. So they can use the supercell and change the configuration, see how the energy changes. So from there, they can therefore predict the properties. Whereas on the other hand, as an experimentalist, we already know the configuration, we already know their properties. Then we can try to correlate what can be improved in a calculation to get it right. So therefore, we'll have a much more informed method of doing theoretical study once we have this atomic scale data that we have collected. So the other way is also possible, that they can assume a structure and do the theory, and then we can come back and validate if this is really happening at the in a realistic material scale.
Very nice. So let us move on. But then it is very nice that these collaborations are picking up, and what MSR is doing, and you are in a position to see these nitrogen and all that is beautiful. Very nice. And so wish you all the very best. And let's move on. Thank you very much. Yeah. So let's move on. And the next talk is by Himanshu Goyal. Can you please share your screen, Himanshu?
Hi, Professor Pradeep. Can you see my screen?
Yes, not full screen though, but yeah.
Go ahead. I'll go in the presentation mode.
Yeah, please go ahead. I'll give you a warning after 20 minutes, and then you have to close.
Yeah.
4 minutes.
Now it's visible. It's in the presentation mode.
It's great. Thank you.
All right. Good evening, everyone. I am Himanshu from Chemical Engineering Department. So after learning about atomic scale materials, let's move to something very different. Clean energy technologies, and specifically their modeling and simulations using high performance computing. So I'll start with why do we need clean energy technologies, because we also have a lot of students here. So I'll start with this chart showing the correlation between Human Development Index and the per capita electricity usage, annual per capita electricity usage. So you can see that most of the developed countries lie on the right hand side of this number, 4,000 kilowatt hours. And a lot of developing countries and undeveloped countries, they are quite to the left-hand side. So from this graph, it's quite clear that as most of the developing countries progress in future, we are going to need more and more energy. So if you look at the condition for India also, we are quite far from this 4,000 target. We may not reach there, but eventually we are going to, our energy consumption per capita is going to increase with time. And we are aware that because of this usage of energy, mainly coming from fossil fuels, we have a lot of greenhouse gases in the environment, and that has caused global warming, and then global warming led climate change. So we have this, this problem where we need to increase the energy consumption, but that energy consumption, increasing energy consumption is also leading to climate change. So what to do? So here I'll show you some key energy trends from these recent reports. So first one is that even though we have this problem of climate change, a majority of the energy requirement is going to be met by fossil fuels in the next coming few decades at least. We have a lot of electrification of transportation sector. Still, a majority of it is going to require liquid fuels, energy dense liquid fuels to work for running. And third, major consumer of this power we consume globally is the chemical industry. So we need to make this chemical industry more energy efficient, as well as replacing some of the fossil fuel based processes with electricity, because we are having more and more electricity from wind and solar. So these are some of the key energy trends I have found. And in my group, we work towards meeting some of these challenges, specifically under these three major application umbrellas. So if we are going to use fossil fuel in the coming next few decades, so one way of using them is that we can capture the CO2 which is released while utilizing them, and convert that carbon dioxide, either store it somewhere or convert into something useful. Second thing is we need this energy dense liquid fuels for transportation sector that we can get from biomass. Biomass is a renewable source of carbon, and we can convert this biomass into high energy density liquids as well as some other chemicals too. And the third need, which is we need more energy efficient processes as well as electrification of chemical processes. These falls under the umbrella of process intensification. So for working on these major applications, I can divide the work which is going on in my group into four major areas. So the first one is modeling and simulation of multiphase reactors, which means we can have mainly gas and solid phases involved. And these multiphase reactors, we study them for producing renewable fuels and chemicals, as well as carbon dioxide capture and utilization. Next is this process intensification. So as I just briefly mentioned, that we want to improve the energy efficiency as well as replace fossil fuels with electricity wherever possible. So we do achieve these goals by using structured reactors and microwave heating. So we can convert electricity into microwaves and then use microwave to heat our chemical reactors rather than burning fossil fuels and heat them. Third one is a very new area for us. It's using electrochemical cells for utilization of CO2 as well as producing hydrogen from electrolyzers. And in the end, we also apply these new data science machine learning techniques in all the models and computations we perform, so to make them computationally faster. So for today's talk, I'll focus on two topics. First one is a production of biofuels from biomass, and second one is process intensification. So I'll begin with the work on biofuel production. So here I'm showing you a image of a single wood particle. Wood is a major biomass which is typically used for producing these biofuels. So if you look inside it, we'll see a very highly anisotropic structure with pores aligned in a certain direction. If you further zoom in, we see that this material is made up of three major types of biopolymers. One is cellulose, hemicellulose, and lignin. And when we apply heat, this heat can break down this molecule into a variety of different chemicals, ranging from as small as hydrogen, methane, and water to large polyaromatic hydrocarbons. So here, typically, we employ some multiphase reactors to perform this conversion of biomass into something useful. And if we look at from the point of mathematics or physics, what happens inside these reactors, we mainly have this chemistry which dictates how this biomass material is converted into all these products. And this chemistry is then coupled with several transport processes like heat transfer, mass transfer, fluid mechanics. All these things are coupled together, and they determine what we are going to get at the end when we supply heat to this biomass. So here it's an example of one of the multiphase reactor which is typically used for this conversion. So you can see what happens inside these reactors through this simulation video. So again, we have this reactor filled with some solid particles at high temperature, and we inject biomass from the side. And when we do that and gas is injected from the bottom, we have a very high mixing, which provide very high heating rates as well as uniformity, and biomass is converted into different products. So now the question is how, first of all, we need to understand how these different processes are coupled together. And then we need to devise or find an optimal point so that we can convert this solid biomass into a product which we desire. It can be liquid fuel, it can be some feedstock chemical, or it can be renewable hydrogen. So to achieve this economically, we need to have a better understanding of what is going on inside these reactors, and we need some modeling tools to design these reactors. So here I'm showing you a video of one such multi-phase reactor at a pilot scale. So this video was made at NATL in US. So they put a glass window in one of the reactors and put a camera to see what is happening. So in these reactors, in this right one, we have gas injected from the bottom at high velocities, and it's filled with some solid particles. So you can see at the large level, we have a lot of particles in the middle of the reactor will go upward, but near the wall, these particles are falling downward. And you can see more closely when we zoom in here, we have these nice particle clusters which are falling downward near the wall. And at the smaller scales, if you look, so you'll find that we have these individual particles which constitute the microscales here. So here I'm talking about size of millimeters. This particle can be few hundreds of microns to few millimeters. And we have different types of physical and chemical processes happening, like particle-particle collision, heat transfer, mass transfer, chemical reactions. So the processes happening at micro scale, they are coupled with the mesoscale and macro scale. So whatever we get out of these reactors, our productivity, yield, or composition of product, it depends on the strong coupling between different scales. So it makes both experimental as well as computational studies of these systems very challenging. And because of these reasons, our current understanding of what happens inside this reactor is very poor. And most of the design and scale up strategies of these reactor are empirical. They have been based on some limited experimental data and some fitted curves. And if today we want to develop some new technology, let's say for carbon capture or biomass conversion, we need to perform a lot of experiments which are expensive and time consuming, and still we cannot possibly explore a large or wide parameter space to come reach an optimal point. So for these reasons, we need some efficient modeling and simulation tools which are predictive in nature as well as computationally efficient. With these type of tools, when they are available, we can get a good understanding of what is happening inside these reactors, how different processes are coupled to each other, as well as based on these tools, we can develop some design and optimization tools that can be used for the reactor scale up as well as their optimization. So when we try to model these reactors, so here is if I arrange all these scales on x-axis, this is what I'm going to get. On the very left hand side, we have the smaller scales which are associated with chemical kinetics. So again, we are in a continuum regime. We are not dealing with atomic scale physics and molecular scale, which after my talk, Professor Jitin is going to talk about density functional theory and the physics happening at atomic scale. So that data, which is performed by DFT simulations or molecular dynamics, the data is used to come up with some of the parameters which are needed for this continuum level simulations. For example, in chemical kinetics, we need Arrhenius parameters that can be obtained from these atomic scale simulations. So after this chemical kinetics, we have particle scale processes where we have heat transfer, mass transfer combined with the chemical reactions. Then all of these are, we need to involve this mesoscale structure, which I just showed in the previous slide, to model the lab scale reactors. After that, we need some pilot scale studies, which are in between lab and industry. And finally, the reactor we are looking at that will be connected with a lot of other reactors and pieces of equipment, finally at the industrial level. And at the industry, what we need very simple algebraic equation type models that are extremely fast and simple to run. And we, in chemical engineering, we use something called SPEN, a software called SPEN, where all these different pieces
Suraj is there. Suraj is there.
So all these simple models are connected together to optimize the entire plant or unit. So our aim is to develop these multi-scale simulation tools so that we can all the way from left-hand side to the right-hand side. So we address this problem in two steps. So first of all, we develop these multi-scale, multi-physics simulations for the lab scale reactors. To do that, what do? We first come up with these chemical kinetic models, which are validated against experiments, combine them with transport equations for particle scale models, and then again validate them against experiments, and then use these particle scale models inside reactor simulation. Then again, we can validate them with lab scale experiments, which can be done in academic setting. So these simulation we develop, they provide deep insight into what is happening at each scale and how different scales are coupled together, but they are computationally expensive and cannot be used for scale up and industrial level optimization. So in the next step, what do? Based on the models we have developed as well as experiments, we develop these simple and computationally fast models using machine learning and other techniques that can be used by industry either for scale up or as well as this optimization at the entire plant level using SPEN type softwares. So first, I'll give one example of this first part of multi-scale modeling for the application of biomass conversion. So again, we have a multi-scale problem in biomass. So first of all, as I mentioned, we start with the modeling of chemical kinetic chemical reactions. So for this particular case, we found a very detailed chemical kinetic model for biomass conversion. And it was, as you can see, it has hundreds of species and reactions, which is computationally, if you have worked on solving the system, it's computationally extremely expensive. So what we did, we used some automatic reduction algorithms to reduce this detailed chemistry into something which majorly a very small kinetic model with 39 species. And once we have this reduced kinetic model, we compare with the detailed model and experiments. We found that it is adequately representing what we are interested in. And then we go to the next step of particle scale modeling. So here, again, when we develop this model, we keep in mind that we will be ultimately using them in a reactor scale simulation. So computational cost is important consideration. So here we write down this one-dimensional transport equations, which are basically conservation of heat, mass, and momentum, combine them with chemical reaction, and we can numerically solve them for a particle scale processes. And then ultimately, all this will be connected with our reactor scale simulations, where we perform these reactive multi-phase computational fluid dynamic simulations. So this is the multi-scale approach we are pursuing. And again, at every step, we focus on validating everything against experiment, so that there is no tuning or fitting involved. Everything is based on first principle. As much as possible, everything is based on first principle based models. So here an example of these multi-scale simulations. So at a time, these are some of the most advanced state-of-the-art simulation available. So we can see now we can study the impact of different reactor dynamics on individual species, like how much carbon monoxide will be produced, or oxygenated aromatics or polyaromatic hydrocarbons, which was not possible earlier. So with these type of simulation tools, the power is that we can determine what should be the ideal conditions at which we can tune the composition of biofuels. We can maximize a particular component or minimize a particular component, and determine the composition of TARS, which is a side product and a major hindrance towards making biomass conversion a major technology. So for these multi-phase simulation, we use our CFD code called NGA, which was developed at Stanford, and we have been using it for the last several years for this biomass simulation. So these are massively parallel simulations, and this NGA code, it has been validated, or its parallel performance has been shown up to 4,000 cores, and we routinely use simulations of right now 50 to 60 cores, and we get almost linear performance when we go from single core to 50 or 60 cores using this NGA. Now the next part is using machine learning to come up with some computationally fast models. So I'll take again the case of this biomass gasification. So in biomass gasification, the gas phase chemistry again is represented by a detailed kinetic model, which I was talking about earlier. So here we use this recurrent neural network model, RNN, to integrate this detailed chemistry with the ideal reactor configuration, which is commonly used in chemical engineering applications. So this is our fluidized bed. We break it down into two zones, and we focus on the gas phase chemistry in the upper zone, which can be modeled as a plug flow reactor. So basically we are simplifying the transport. Ultimately, we're not solving any transport equation. We are only solving the chemistry equations. So first, to develop a machine learning model, we need high fidelity training data, which encompass all the possible data which our model will be used in the future. So first step, we use the one-dimensional biomass intraparticle biomass pyrolysis model, which gives us some primary products. These primary products go to the second zone and get converted into secondary products, which are basically syngas and TARS. TARS are the side products, and we want to maximize the syngas yield. So this plug flow reactor, we are assuming the gas phase zone, or the Z2 zone here, is a plug flow reactor, and then using this data, we train an RNN model. So here I'm showing just one graph to show how the RNN model performs compared to actual when we solve a full detailed kinetic model using ODE solvers. So you can see a lot of these major products like CO, CO2, methane, and different aromatic species. We can predict all of these at different temperatures for transient evolution. And when we compare the computational cost, so the RNN model is about 4 order of magnitude require less computation compared to actual ODE solvers for the chemical kinetics. So in this particular area, this is just a start. We are now trying to integrate detailed chemistry with reactor simulations using this machine learning models. Now I'll shift gear and move towards the second application we are focusing on. It is process intensification. So there are many varieties or many techniques of process intensification people follow. In my lab, what we do, we try to develop these optimal structured reactors. You can see some of the pictures here, like monolith, open cell form, that can replace the traditionally existing fixed bed and other types of reactors, which are very common in chemical industry. So one benefit of this structured reactor is that we can tune their geometry to achieve a particular property. For example, effective thermal conductivity to maintain a uniform temperature throughout the reactor. So for a given material and application, we can we are developing design tools that can provide us the optimal geometry of these reactors, and then using machine learning, using 3D printers, we can actually create these reactors in lab very easily based on the design we create, and then test them in the lab. So that is the direction we are pursuing. So one is this structured reactors using conventional heating, and the second technique we apply for process intensification is use of microwave heating. So as I mentioned earlier, we can use this renewable electricity to produce microwaves, which are nothing but electromagnetic waves in the frequency range of 300 megahertz to 300 gigahertz. But the most common frequency which is used for microwaves, 2.45 gigahertz. Even in our kitchen microwaves, this is the frequency we are using. So in the microwaves, most of the material we commonly encounter in chemical engineering, they interact with the electric field component. So as you know that in electromagnetic wave, the direction of electric field changes at a very high rate because of this large frequency. And the polar molecules or ions present in the medium try to align themselves with this changing direction, but there'll be some resistance, which causes heating of the material. So very recently, experimental groups, they have found a really interesting phenomena with this micro heating for multiphase reactors. So here, when we have these are two silicon carbide particles of size few millimeters. They are in contact with each other. When we apply micro heating, people have found that the temperature at the contact point can be about 100 degrees Celsius higher than the bulk temperature. Similarly, in the slurries, slurry basically some solid particle dispersed in liquid medium. Again, when the particles are very close to each other, we
That
see
is 20 minutes.
Okay, thanks, Professor. We have this glowing hot spots present because of microheating. Similarly, in monolith. So in monolith has found a lot of attraction in the last 4 or 5 years in the scientific community, because we have seen that in the monolith, we can create this lower temperature zone in the channel, hollow channels, and the solid phase will be at higher temperature. Specifically, up to 7, it has been shown that up to 70 degrees Celsius can be maintained between the solid and gas phase. And let's imagine that we want to use a monolith for a catalytic reaction, where we want the reaction of interest to be happening at the solid phase. But there will always be some side homogeneous reaction in these channels. So now if we can create this large temperature difference between solid and gas phase, we can minimize the rate of side reaction in the hollow channels. And by tuning this geometry, we can, it's expected that we can go make this temperature difference much higher. Or if in a particular geometry we want to reduce it, we can do that also. So this is what we are focusing on right now, developing computational tools that can be used to quickly come up with these optimal designs of these type of different structured reactors, which can be used in conventional heating or micro heating applications to achieve process intensification. Here is an example. We have been doing this highly detailed CFD simulation in monolith with micro heating. Depending on the material, you can see that temperature uniformity can vary. And these simulations are computationally expensive. So what do we need to do? We are developing techniques to reduce the computational cost. So one particular technique we are using under this umbrella is homogenization theory, where we take a unit cell of the multiphase system we are interested in. We perform some simulation at the unit cell level, calculate the effective properties, and then represent the multiphase reactor as a homogeneous single phase. So thereby, by doing this, we can still get the overall reactor level performance, for example, temperature profiles and all, but the computational cost becomes extremely low. As a specific example, my MS student is working on this problem, where he's taking this monolith reactor and replacing it with a homogenized mixed phase. And you can see that the grid requirement sharply reduces. So here is the comparison of the temperature along the width in the center line for this system. So you can see the blue line here is the temperature profile we obtained from the first simulation, which is the actual monolith. The red line is what we get in a single phase system. So you can see that we can't get these fluctuations which are happening because we are moving from gas and solid phase, but overall the temperature profiles are very close. And so we can get this type of reactor level performance, but at a fraction of cost. So you can see if we compare the grid as well as time, we get about 2 orders of magnitude reduction in the computational time. So overall, in our group, we have been working on this modeling and simulations for, as I mentioned, multiphase reactors, process intensification. We are also started working on electrochemical cells and also apply machine learning to reduce the computational cost. So this is the overview of what we have been doing. And since the main agenda of this meeting is to set up collaborations, we are interested in doing collaborations, people doing experiments at, let's say, transport-free chemistry, reactor level experiments, as well as theoretical people who can develop theory or understand how microwaves are coupled with chemical reaction, because that is an open question right now. A lot of people say that microwaves couple with the chemical bonds and affect the activation energy, but a lot of people say it is not feasible. So we need people from chemistry and physics background also to demystify these type of problems. So yes, Professor Pradeep, I think I'm done.
Well, thank you. So it was a fantastic tour through molecular scale science, connecting to pilot plants and how we can engineer the knowledge into something very useful products, and particularly looking at renewable energy. So very nice. And obviously, I know that the group here itself, there are people who would be intensely, interested in something that you are doing, like here. I see Rajneesh Kumar, and there's a colleague of ours called Raja Kumar, and people like that who are into these. But let me ask you one question of particular importance. We have just about four minutes or so to ask these. So one of the aspects of biofuels or bio-related economy is biorefining. And a major aspect of biorefining is biology, meaning utilizing yeast and utilizing biological processes to make alcohol or polymers or any such thing. And that is what is globally picking up. And from our journal perspective also, this is something, sustainable chemistry and engineering, which I'm also an associate editor of that. So all of these is in that area also, a whole lot of kinetics and kinetic equations, individual processes, they need to be understood. And I understand that the current biorefining larger problem in that is also process. Finally, individual molecular events are understood, but how do you optimize this at a scale, particularly a scale that is useful for our country, wherein biomaterials are not available in the quantities that America or Canada would have. So there are complex issues in this. So how would you address a challenge of that kind in the context of several products coming out, as you said, but then they are not combustion? So they are biological. But then the great thing is that the temperatures are far too low, but the system itself is complex.
So first of all, the biomass conversion techniques we are looking at is thermochemical conversion here.
Yeah.
So it's basically taking known food sources of biomass and applying heat. So maintain temperature about 500 to 600 degrees Celsius if we are interested in liquid fuel, or about 800 to 1000 degrees Celsius if you're interested in syngas, for example. But again,
colleagues, please consider asking questions. And so we have a couple of minutes more. Yeah, thank you. Go ahead.
So from what I understand, there is not a single technique we can say that which is going to be finally used. As you mentioned, you hinted about refineries. So when we have different types of biomass feedstock and depending on the local requirement of the bioproducts, I think a combination of these different methods need to be used. It can be enzymatic based conversion or some hydropyrolysis, or different types of techniques are available depending on what biomass feedstock you have and what is the product we want to achieve.
Manchu, very nice. I mean, your these thermochemical conversion and all that is greatly needed, and I understand that. I was only asking that the 2G biorefining, which is coming up and picking up, and our our ministry is talking very highly about those. This is where IIT can also contribute significantly. So from that perspective, looking at biorefining, how do you contribute? And that is the process is the critical issue. That when my biologists tell me that, hey, you know, I can make anything into ethanol. But the moment I ask an industrialist, they say, hey, at what cost? Huh? If anything is not at 36 rupees, well, 30 to 36 rupees, it's not going to break even. So that was the reason to ask you that question. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, so the skills we use here can be applied in biological and other types of techniques also, like combining chemistry with the transport processes. So that is what happens when we scale things up. When we do something in a while, we are not limited by the transport, mass transfer and heat transfer limitations. So everything is happening nicely, smoothly. But when we go to big reactors, there the limitation of mixing and heat transfer and mass transfer, everything comes into picture. So this interplay and coupling between these transport processes and chemistry is what is heart of what we are doing. In all the problems, if you look at the main core is coupling of chemistry and transport processes and understanding that and optimizing that.
Great. So there is a national interest in connecting the right teams together in building a biorefining project. I suppose you know, you can participate in it. That is what I seem to understand.
Okay. I'll get more information about it from you. Maybe
right.
I'll write you an email and get it.
Great. Yeah. So are there other questions, please? Rajneesh.
No, he just sits beside me, so I can ask him offline.
Yeah,
I think it's time. Yeah.
Okay. All right. Because I saw you, and this is related to what you're doing.
Yeah. We are actually working together on a couple of projects, Professor Pradeep.
Oh, thank you. Very nice. Well, it's a good mix of science, chemistry, and physics, and transport equations, and chemical engineering.
So there are a couple of points that he mentioned are actually similar to what I am going to speak, but in a completely different setting. This is Prabhu here. So I will hint upon those correspondences when I start talking. Yeah.
Looking forward to your talk.
Yeah, especially when you spoke about, you know, materials whose properties are dependent on geometry and arrangement rather than from the material itself. So that's something of fundamental interest to me. And I think it's fascinating to look at that from a very different perspective, the way you are looking at it. So, yeah.
Thank you.
I think we will have avenues to discuss together. Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you, Himanshu, for that wonderful talk. Next, we have Jitin John Varghese. He is going to tell us about atomic modeling for catalysis. Again, we are at 7:04, and I will give you a warning at 7:24.
Sure. Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you, everyone, for joining in, and thank you, Professor Pradeep and team, for organizing this talk series. I don't know if it is by design or coincidence. The two speakers before me have kind of set the scene very well for what I'm going to talk about, because Professor Pradeep talked about atomic scale, and Professor Himanshu talked about multiscale, and I'm going to touch upon both of these with a little bit more on the atomic scale side, but primarily for catalysis. So I've titled my presentation Atomistic Modeling for Catalysis, and that's primarily what we do in my group. So a quick introduction to start with. So as chemical engineers, I am a chemical engineer by training, and as chemical engineers, we are trained primarily to understand and investigate phenomena at a chemical reactor scale or a process scale for that matter. So if you look at this particular chart, so we're looking at primarily this particular spatio-temporal scales that we're dealing with. But catalytic reactors form the core of most of the chemical processes that we know of. So if you think about this as a catalytic reactor, and what is shown here to be catalysts which are loaded into solid catalysts or heterogeneous catalysts, as I would be interested in loaded into this particular reactor scale. So if you zoom in, what you would normally see is that these are pellets of these catalysts, which probably have some shapes like this. You zoom in further, what you would really come to identify is the microstructure of the catalyst, and you keep on zooming into length scales of nanometric region. We basically come to an atomic scale resolution where we are now able to understand what is the specific atomic arrangement of this particular catalyst. And this particular atomistic domain is what I'm specifically interested in, and a lot of my research is focused around this particular domain, specifically to understand how these specific atomic arrangements on the solid catalyst or the heterogeneous catalyst impact the interaction of these catalysts with the specific reactants, and how that determines the final product outcome in the typical catalytic processes. So the interest is to understand phenomena at an atomistic scale or at an active site kind of a resolution to kind of come back and exploit such information that we have, both in terms of design of catalysts up in the scale, and to put them back into reactors so that you do have what we call a bottom-up catalytic reaction engineering approach. And this is specifically the multiscale approach that Professor Himanshu was talking about. So he was talking specifically on the multi-scale region, primarily in these. So what I will talk about is the computational catalysis, which primarily is within this domain or the atomistic scale domain. So the interest, or rather some of the techniques that we use basically involve theoretical frameworks which have their foundation in quantum mechanics, or they are referred to as ab initio techniques. And one of the most popular ones that are used in catalysis investigations is what is called the density functional theory. They are also fairly popular methods to investigate materials properties. So DFT is the density functional theory, which is a workhorse for most of the computational catalysis applications. So a lot of the work that we do in my group is to use and exploit these kind of simulations on various catalytic systems, and also a few other techniques, and also combine information from these techniques across techniques which can take up the information, which is again the multi-scale approach that has been talked about. And a couple of those that we are trying to work on along with some colleagues in the department is a microkinetic modeling approach, which is again a framework to utilize an atomistic scale information into a kinetic modeling framework, which can kind of couple the information that you have with the microstructure of the catalyst to understand more of a macroscopic phenomena. So microkinetic modeling, kinetic Monte Carlo kind of simulations are something that we are trying to work on, exploiting information from the atomistic scale. And the objective would be, as Professor Himanshu had mentioned, to use all of this kinetic information back into more of the transport coupled equations to understand reactor scale phenomena. But again, like I said, my focus and my group primarily works on this particular site. And as I will be speaking very soon, we also are working very closely with colleagues to be integrating simulations with experiments. And I'll come to that in a few slides. So this, I believe, is a fairly generic audience. So let me just give a couple of quick reminders of things that most of us might be familiar with. This is on catalysis and what a catalyst would most likely be doing, so that it's easier to understand and comprehend what I would be speaking in terms of an atomistic catalysis phenomena. So if you consider a specific species A, which we can call it as a reactant, which is getting transformed into a product B, if I now try to understand this particular transformation of A to B on what is called a reaction coordinate, which is representing this transformation with a track of the energy that is going on. This is something that most of us have seen some point in our lives. This transformation requires to have the A going through what is called an activated complex or a transition state before it can form the final product B. And this energy value that you trace from the reactant to this activated complex of the transition state is what we call as the activation energy barrier, which is required to be supplied for this particular species to go from this energy state to the final product state. And this energy difference that you see between the A and the B, which is the reactant and the product, is typically the reaction energy or reaction enthalpy, if you would like to call it. So these are some basic definitions that most of us are familiar with. Now, if this process happens in the presence of a catalyst, there is a minor difference to what happens out here. The virtue of the presence of the catalyst now brings in an additional step, which is an adsorption step, where typically you do have an interaction of the species with the catalyst. And most often when you have a solid catalyst and a species interacting, adsorption is a favorable energy step, or the system energy is lower. So you have an adsorbed complex that is formed. The species now undergoes a transformation to form again an adsorbed species, which is shown here, again through a transition state. And this adsorbed species desorbs to give the final product that is B. So what is different when you have a catalyst, if you look at it, is that the activated complex that you have right now in the presence of the catalyst has an energy which is significantly lower than what it was. And this is by virtue of the interaction of this particular species that was undergoing the transformation with the catalyst. And what you would notice is the activation barriers that you would require for this particular step is significantly lower than what it was in a non-catalytic process. So with that said, what we were interested in trying to understand is how different catalysts are able to do these different transformations of reactions differently, or how different active sites on the same kind of catalyst behave to determine what really happens when A goes to B. And especially A going to B is usually never the case. There are multiple B, C, D, E, F, etc. that are typically formed. So to be forming a specific product that is of interest, how exactly the interaction of the catalyst with these different reactant species or the intermediates, and how those are determined based on the energy levels that you have for each of them is what we are trying to understand in most of the work that we do. So to be starting off these kind of interactions, or sorry, investigations, these are a few prerequisites. One is definitely a model for the catalyst. I'll come to that in a minute. Basically, I'm referring to a structure of the material of the catalyst. And this is not very trivial to do, especially in the context of heterogeneous catalysts, because they do not have a fixed molecular formula like most other molecules are. And modeling the catalyst to be representative of what they are in actual reactions is a fairly complex process, and that's something that needs to be done fairly correctly. We also need to have representative structures of the reactant and the product, that's obvious, and all the possible intermediates that are possibly involved in this transformation. So once we have this, the different simulations that we perform, especially the ones that involve density functional theory simulation and so on, are able to understand interactions and the energy levels for each of these. So with that, what we are able to do is to identify specific mechanisms of the transformation, identify transition states for such transformations, and with transition states, the energy barriers for such transformations. So this particular animation that you see is just to prove or rather showcase some of the kind of things that we can do. So this is what you see in the peach color is a representation of a copper catalyst, these peach color balls that you see. This species that you see is a molecule which is glycerol, which is my reactant, so to speak. This atom that you see, which is the red colored ball that you have here, is oxygen. And the white color that is moving is a hydrogen atom. So this particular animation shows how the dissociation of an OH bond can happen on a copper catalyst. And of course, with these kind of images, I mean, you can also calculate what is the energy of the transition state, what was exactly the atomic configuration of the transition state, and so on. So this is that kind of an example where I have a different molecule here. This is propane. You have a different catalyst, which is a cerium oxide. And what is represented here is what is the actual structure of what that transition state or activated complex was. So you can see that there is a carbon-hydrogen bond that is being broken here. The length of this particular bond is something that we can see from this image. And there is a oxygen to a hydrogen bond that is being formed. And the lengths in these particular case are intermediate between what they would be when this hydrogen transfers from this carbon to the oxygen. So this is a transition state. We have information about structure. We have information about the energy. So this is something which is very typical in the kind of work that we do. If you do this kind of an analysis on detailed mechanisms, what we are able to do is full reaction pathways analysis for formation of multiple different products if there are. With these kind of simulations, we're also able to do analysis and investigations on materials properties or catalytic materials properties, trends across different materials, and so on. So a very quick overview of what computational catalysis is from my perspective. So first of all, we should have some information of what exactly we are looking for. Once we have that, there are a few different things that go into this kind of a typical investigation. The first is, as I mentioned briefly before, an appropriate and accurately represented model of the catalyst, which is basically saying whatever is your catalyst structure under typical reaction conditions that you are expecting, that represented in a tractable way is the model that I'm referring to, and not necessarily a mathematical model that typically we understand when we say a model. So this is a structural model that I'm talking about in this particular case. Since we are understanding interactions of the different species with these catalyst or catalyst models, we also need some basic theories to be able to study those interactions and study those energies. And most often we rely on quantum mechanics based theoretical frameworks. Like I said, density functional theory is one of the most widely used ones. Classical mechanics kind of theory frameworks are also used in some phenomena when you don't really need to understand chemical processes. So once we have these, we also need basic algorithms and software. In my group, we don't work towards developing softwares and codes. We use open source as well as licensed codes that are available. A few of the ones that we use in the group or have used in the past and are planning to use are listed out here. Some of them are open source, some of them are licensed. So once we have all of this, the last thing that we would need for such a project or an investigation is appropriate, adequate computational resources. And as Professor Himanshu mentioned, these simulations, especially with density functional theory or a quantum mechanics background, they are extremely computationally intensive, which cannot be performed on your typical laptops or your typical workstations and require high performance computing kind of systems to be able to perform such simulations. So me and my group, we are heavily dependent on the Aqua cluster, HPC cluster, for doing this kind of work. So with this, I'll just shift gears and show one example of the work that is done in the group. This is the work done by my student, Mr. Balaji. I'll be showing him later in a slide. So this work is on catalytic conversion of CO2 into methanol. So this is a reaction that is of great interest because you're converting a gas, and a gas that is of great interest or rather menacing gas. And this waste gas, if you can convert it, it can be converted into a liquid like methanol, which is a fuel and also a liquid, a bulk chemical, which can be converted into a wide range of other chemicals. This is of great interest both in academics as well as for the industry. So if you look at the reaction, it's very simple. You only have to put in 4 hydrogens in this particular system, CO2, and eliminate 1 oxygen. So that's a very simple chemical transformation if you look at the reaction scheme. But most often, all of the catalysts that are used for this particular investigation are fairly complex, and they are multi-component, which means you have multiple components. And most often what happens is they play different functions. So what I'm showing here is an image of one such representative multi-component catalyst. Represented here, you have a copper component, you have a zinc oxide component, you have a zirconium oxide component, which is shown out here. So the catalyst here has copper, zinc oxide, zirconium oxide. What you see here is a carbon dioxide molecule, which in principle is a linear molecule. 180 degrees is the angle between OC and O. But this image here shows the interaction of CO2 with this particular catalyst interacting with a zirconium atom here and the copper atom here on the surface. And this interaction leads to severe bending of this originally linear molecule. So this is adsorption of the reactant. And what is shown here is basically a transformation of CO2 into methanol. So we start with CO2 that is adsorbed over here. What is shown here is an energy plot. And what is shown here is basically the reaction sequence. And all of these different steps that you see are intermediate chemical species that are formed before methanol forms here as the final product. So a wide range of products that you can see. Of interest as intermediates are two specific ones. The first one that you see here is a result of a hydrogen which is interacting or attacking the carbon atom, and it forms this particular species called a formate species. Alternatively, if the hydrogen interacts or attacks this particular oxygen or this particular oxygen, the species that you can form is what is called a carboxyl, which is represented here, in which case you have a different set of intermediates and a completely different set of energy that you have to form methanol. Now, just keep in mind that the interaction of the carbon dioxide was with a zirconium atom, which is shown here. And I had mentioned this particular catalyst also has zinc. And if you notice, if the interaction of the carbon dioxide is with the zinc atom, we can actually have an investigation of the same set of reaction intermediates and the same two pathways that I showed. And if you look at the energy diagram, I'm sorry, this is a little complicated. So the bottom ones, the ones in blue, red, and orange are what we had seen in the previous slide. The two new lines or the curves that you have, the one in gray that you can trace here, and the one in yellow that you can trace here, are the pathways that you have on the zinc atom that you have. So the point I'm trying to drive here is the catalyst is the same, but the interaction of CO2 with the active site, which now became zinc instead of the zirconium, has changed the energetics of this process completely. Now, we have also done other kinds of investigation, and we find that the chemical identity of this particular species, depending on what's the oxidation state of the catalyst, not only is the energy very different, but we also have alternative intermediates and alternative pathways that are coming. I've not shown that here for the sake of simplicity. So the point here is we can do extensive reaction pathways analysis, energetics analysis to understand how the transformation of a particular reactant happened to the final product that we have. So with that, I'll just quickly move on to a few different things that we are working on in the group. So primarily, we are interested in heterogeneously catalyzed reactions for applications in environment, chemicals, and energy. In doing all of this, we do look at mechanisms, pathways, kinetic modeling, effect of solvents on kinetics and thermodynamics, understanding materials properties, structure property relations, and so on. So over the last 2.5 to 3 years that I've been here in IIT, we have started looking at a wide range of problems which are listed out here, and also been fortunate to be interacting very closely and working very closely with a few colleagues both in the department and outside in some of these cases to integrate both simulations and experiments, and again, as I had spoken earlier, to integrate simulations across different length and time scales. And this is one problem that many of us from the Department of Chemical Engineering are working towards, including Professor Himanshu, under the umbrella of what is called the Carbon Capture Utilization and Storage Lab, of which Professor Rajneesh, who is here in the talk, is also a part of. So our role specifically is in understanding how CO2 can be utilized in thermocatalytic means. And we are looking at integrating a multi-scale simulation framework to experiments to understand how this process can be optimized further. So these are a wide range of topics that we are looking at in my group. Quick explanation of what specific aspects are, again, from an atomistic perspective. The first topic that I'd like to introduce is conversion of methane to, again, methanol, the liquid that
we are at 20 minutes. Huh?
Thank you very much. So this transformation, again, if you look at it, it's very, very simple to look at. You have methane, which is CH4. All that you would need to do if you have to get methanol is to insert one oxygen. So basically, this is a partial oxidation reaction if you'd like to think about it. But what happens in reality is that the methanol that is formed at the typical conditions that this process would happen undergoes what is called over-oxidation, and the result is typically carbon dioxide, which is not what we are interested in. So to understand how we can limit the methanol, the oxidation of methane to methanol, a lot of research interest has been in looking at liquid phase reactions instead of gas phase reactions, and looking at what are called atomically dispersed catalysts, where you have just one active site or a couple of active sites, and we are looking at two different catalytic types. So you have atomically dispersed catalysts on metal oxides. We have these single or binuclear active site-based catalysts dispersed on zeolite matrices. And we're looking at the reactions happening in solvents like water and other organic liquids. So the reason I'm showing images of or names of students who are working on this is a lot of students are on this talk as well. If anybody is interested in knowing more about this work, feel free to contact these students or PhD students working in this particular area. So the second theme that I had spoken about is thermocatalytic conversion of CO2 into chemicals. The example that I gave was CO2 conversion into methanol. The work that I showed was by Mr. Balaji. So we are interested in looking at this kind of transformation on complex catalysts, which could be, again, as represented here, which has a metal component, you have metal oxide component, and so on. We are interested in identifying how we can tailor the catalyst to be able to tailor the final product that we have. Because what happens in the hydrogenation of CO2, one of the typical byproducts that form is carbon monoxide, and this is not what we want when this particular hydrogenation reaction happens. What we want is the reaction to proceed in this route to get to methanol and not to go in this route to produce CO. So we're trying to understand how catalyst microstructure can be tailored to get methanol selectively. This is one part of the work. I have 3 students who are looking at this, starting off with experiments as well as simulations. So Balaji is one student, Soham is another student, and Joe Souza, MTech student, who's working with this on this project. So you have also one student looking at non-hydrogen based utilization route, which is converting CO2 without hydrogen to a chemical which is a cyclic carbonate, which is used here. And the catalytic material that is of interest here is what is called the metal organic frameworks, or the zeolitic imidazole frameworks. Interest in this stemmed from the fact that these materials are also being used as materials for capture of CO2 or separation of CO2. That's another topic that we'll be talking about. So this investigation is basically to see if we can combine capture and reactions in some way to see if we can produce some chemicals without hydrogen. So the next topic that I'll briefly discuss is converting alkanes to alkenes. This is a dehydrogenation reaction. 2 alkanes that we are working with is propane and ethane. We are interested in looking at 2 kinds of catalysts. One is a metal oxide and the other is a metal carbide. Both of them are fairly complex catalysts because their structure undergoes severe changes during reaction, and understanding what is the actual structure under reaction conditions that is responsible for the actual reaction is something that we are trying to understand. So I have 3 students, rather 2 students and a project staff working on this. This is Mr. Anup looking at ODH of propane. We have Ashajit who's going to look at both experiments and simulations of ODH of ethane on a metal carbide. We also have Anju, who's currently doing some experiments with Professor Selvam on, again, this particular reaction. Another area is converting biomass, bio-waste to other chemicals, which is removing oxygen-containing species or oxygen in these species by using hydrogen. The reaction is called hydrodeoxygenation. 2 prototype molecules that we are trying to work with is glycerol, which is a waste product or a byproduct of many different processes, including biodiesel production. And one of a high-value product that can be produced is 1,3-propanediol. This is a prototype molecule that comes from biomass processing, specifically lignin processing, and we are looking at specific, very selective transformation of these molecules to high-value products like say creosote. This is a slight deviation from the catalytic reaction side, which is using solid materials for adsorption and separation. This is an area that we have recently started working on. So we are looking at these MOF materials as a medium to separate CO2 from gaseous mixture, and PhD student Ashok is going to work on this particular area. So the last topic that we are trying to look at is catalytic conversion of NOx in an ammonia treated manner to convert it into nitrogen. So this is the selective catalytic reduction route. And we're also looking at some non-catalytic NOx oxidation in some experiments where Sai Teja is a project staff, and we have Tamil Mani, who's a postdoc who's doing some simulation work. So one last slide to stop. So this is something that I think we should be doing, and this is where I hope we can have some collaborations. So I am primarily an simulations person, and as Professor Pradeep had mentioned in his talk, one of the things that experimental techniques that can give us as a starting point is the structure of the catalytic materials. And we are extremely dependent on the identity and the catalytic structure to be even starting the modeling work that we do. So that is definitely a point of interaction that we are looking at from all the experimental colleagues in IITM to be giving us structure. And there is also specific interest to combine, spectroscopic techniques, which can also be done computationally, which is a modeling approach, to combine experimental and computational techniques to be devising some methods to determine structure of catalysts under working conditions. So this is an area, again, that I'm hoping that we can have some fruitful discussions with colleagues. Otherwise, these are things that we've been working very closely with colleagues for understanding, developing kinetic models and looking at reaction optimization. So I'm sorry I've exceeded time a little. That's all from me. Thank you very much. If anybody would like to contact me, that's my.
So thank you. Thank you. So we have, well, just about 2 minutes now for
I'm sorry about that.
session. Now, let me ask some, well, people can think about questions, and let me ask one question to begin with. So whatever you talked about is very dear to chemistry, whatever physics and biology, material science, and all that, because everyone is dealing with molecules. So there should be a lot of interest in this, and I was particularly looking forward to meeting somebody like this, although it took quite some time to see you, so that's one thing. We'll discuss that in greater detail. But let me ask you one question in the context of the CO2 methanol problem.
Yes.
When you looked at that particular catalyst, I was thinking of some generalization, because that is what calculations can give you. On the one side, you have a zinc there. Another side, you have a zirconium there.
Yes.
And one is on the right side of the periodic table. Another is on the extreme left of the periodic table. So this combination on the, when I was looking at the reaction channels, I saw this COO channel as well as, these two channels are essentially having some relations to these atoms that are there on the left or the right.
Yes.
I was wondering, by combining another atom which is in the middle, or additional aspects such as bringing in a non-metal from the P block, are there some ways by which better effective catalysts can be built? Or is it always true that you have left and right?
Yes, there is usually a left and right. And in the computational catalysis world, one of the common things that you would normally see is what is called the volcano plot, which is an activity peak at somewhere in the middle. And what you usually see is the ones that are a combination of possibly an inactive catalyst versus an active catalyst usually ends up giving a fairly active catalyst. So there is possibly a middle. But it's not always a generalization that can be made because sometimes a combination of materials not only result in specific sites, but we also need to look at what is the final structure that it ends up with. So unless we are able to pinpoint on the structure, so the way I showed the structure of the zinc and the zirconium as specific atoms. So if it really doesn't appear in exactly that particular way that I'd shown, that specificity in determining those pathways and energetics need not necessarily be there. So in most often, we do expect that you should have some middle when you pick elements from, say, somewhere in the middle of the two ends that you spoke about. Yes. But it's not always generalized.
Yeah, sure. Are there other questions, colleagues?
Hi, Pradeep. Just quick clarification. Jitin, was a very nice talk, and also the chemistry and engineering. I just missed for a few minutes. I don't know. That's why I'm just trying to ask you something related to the nitrogen to any of the products like ammonia. Have you been tried with using some of those metal dope thing you talked?
So I have not looked at ammonia synthesis myself. I'm sure there is a whole group in the community that's interested in ammonia synthesis. I have personally not looked at ammonia synthesis. But I'm sure there is plenty of interest, or rather plenty of things that we can.
Well, I mean, if it is not been tried, do you think there's a possibility that it might work with some of?
So there have been a lot of different, at least lab scale synthesizable catalysts, which have performance which are much better than some of the expensive ones that are typically used. But I think one of the things that also we need to keep in mind is in terms of translating into a chemical process, these materials also need to show catalytic stability over extremely long periods of time.
Correct.
So I guess some of the reasons that many of these catalysts which show extreme performance do not really turn out in practice is that, I mean, they probably are not economically viable for a commercial process. But in principle, to my understanding, there have been plenty of demonstrations of catalysts which have been brought about by mixing up components which are not as active individually.
Thank you. Let's of course, there are other questions. So yeah, let's move on in the interest of time. Thank you, Jitin. Very well. Yeah. The last speaker of the day is Professor Prabhu Rajagopal. And so we are starting at 7:36, 7:37. I will give you a warning at after 20 minutes. Yeah, thank you.
Sure. So are you all able to see my screen?
Yes, but it is not full screen, however.
Now?
Yeah, yes.
Thank you, Professor Pradeep, for bringing us together, actually. And many of us think of this kind of initiative, but you are the one doing it. So please accept my appreciation. I'm sure many of us are appreciating this effort. And whether by design or not, I am the only buffer between everybody and dinner. So I will hopefully be on time. So I wanted to talk about phononic metamaterials today, and that is connected to this journey. This is so it's when I started putting these slides together, I felt that describing it in this manner as a journey would be more interesting to the audience who may all not be familiar with this subject as such. So that's the journey here. So I am a professor with the Department of Mechanical Engineering, and I am also finally a master. I'm also a graduate of IIT Madras as such, 2003, and Professor Pradeep taught us chemistry as well, actually. So my general interest is in the remote inspection of realistic structures. And when I say realistic, I mean structures that are under challenging conditions, such as maybe high temperature, very high pressures, radiation, those kinds of environmental conditions, and also the structures which are reasonably complex in their topology. So for example, a aircraft wing box from a fighter aircraft. So I try to address these from two perspectives. One is to try and use inspection robotics to be able to send devices and monitor the structures remotely. And the other device or tool is for me is guided ultrasound, or ultrasound guided by features such as ribs, stiffeners, bends, or pipes, rods, plates, and so on. So this is a snapshot of some of the work that I do in robotics. So I'm not a roboticist from a purist perspective, but rather I would like to build things that can take my sensors and perform inspections in a robust and a reliable manner. So that's my interest. And from that perspective, I think this effort is unique, because a lot of robotics work is done from bottoms up, from theory to implementations. So we have here robots for inspection of pipelines, for tanks, bio-inspired robots. And one of the works that has gained a lot of traction in recent years is robots for inspection of septic tanks, so that we can help eliminate manual scavenging. On the two cool, spherical robots you see on the right side are actually they look like football or a cricket ball, but they are of those sizes, but those are robots to be sent into pipelines for inspections. So this work has had a lot of industrial traction, so a lot of industrial support as well. Now, the other area of interest to me is guided ultrasonics, which is try to send sound guided by extended features, which like plates and pipes and so on. And I'll come to guided ultrasonics again later. the attraction of guided ultrasonics is that we can use multiple modes, and some of these modes have very different mode shapes, and therefore they give us feature-rich information about the structures we are inspecting. They also travel long distances from a single point of inspection. But the challenge with them is that the frequencies typically tend to be much lower compared to what ultrasound is. And so the wavelength is very large, and hence we end up with very poor resolution. So that's the trigger smoking gun, which I will use later as well. So I'm also very interested in technology translation, because I fervently and passionately believe that what we develop as high science or high technology in our laboratories must find their way out to practical application. And unfortunately, given our bandwidth as a university, we do not have the capabilities to do complete translation. And in this process, I believe that startups are a good partner for us. And these are some startups that have come out of my work and our lab. Planis is the most well-known of these. Planis does robots for inspection of open marine structures. And today they are the only solution provider in the country for inspection of dams and road crossings of bridges. More recently, Zyma is the one that commercializes our waveguide sensing solutions. So with those few words, I'll come to this particular topic. So this is the elastic wave spectrum or the phonon spectrum. So many of you would be familiar with the electromagnetic wave spectrum, and this is less commonly shown. For example, how we span the spectrum of going all the way from infrasound, which is frequencies below what we can hear, to sound, which is the normal audible frequency range, and then ultrasound, which is any elastic disturbance about 20 kilohertz, all the way going to few hundreds of gigahertz. And then more recently, we have had a lot of interest in hypersound, which is gigahertz range sound. And finally, thermal phenomena as well, which are also elastic wave phenomena, but incoherent. So heat and sound are just different aspects of the same phenomenon at two different spectral limits as such. So my interest is in this whole spectrum, and elastic waves in particular are very exciting. And I believe that the coming decades are going to be about elastic waves as much as the previous decades were about electromagnetic waves. And I have my reasons to believe that. And I'll skip some of this stuff, but just to say that initially I started working on guided waves and applications for guided waves. And all of this was leading me into metamaterials. And why that was the case, I will say. So elastic waves are generally very attractive for diagnostic applications, whether in engineering or in biomedicine, because they offer very good penetration into materials. So examples of elastic waves include sound and ultrasound. But the problem is, and the other attraction is, they can be very cost effective, and they are also non-ionizing compared to electromagnetic techniques. But the problem is they offer very poor resolution as compared to typical electromagnetic techniques such as X-ray or even MRI as such. So they are very good safety-wise, they're very good cost-wise, and you can go deep inside materials, but they are very poor in resolution. So this was what got me particularly interested to see how can we solve this problem. The classical resolution limit is that we can resolve up to half a wavelength. So as I was talking about guided waves, and the wavelength is very large, the wavelength in guided waves is typically tens of centimeters. So the best resolution you can get is a few centimeters. And that is definitely not good enough for many of the diagnostic applications. So there are two ways to do this. One, we go very high frequencies, and I'm going to talk about that last if I have time. And the other is we try to break this resolution limit. So why only lambda by 2? Can we go lambda by x? That's the first aspect that we started looking at. And this is what led us to metamaterials. So metamaterials are a class of materials that have been investigated with much interest across the range of disciplines over the last 3 decades. Ever since Vasalago in the 60s proposed these materials, these are media whose properties come about because of structure rather than because of the underlying materials. So the classical materials are all those in the first quadrant here. density positive, compliance also positive. But if any of these starts to get negative, so when we talk about negative density, what we mean here is in the dynamic sense, not in a static sense. So then you start seeing all sorts of extraordinary properties: enhanced absorption, enhanced transmission, negative refraction, that is non-Snell's law behavior. These are all possible by just arrangement of material in certain in certain patterns. So as regards to the resolution issue, so our work in our lab has reported the highest resolution worldwide for ultrasonics using these phononic metamaterials, and these have been summarized in a series of journal papers now. So I was going to say refer to these when I interjected during Himanshu's question answer session. So these are some of the structured materials. So this was the very first work in this series of papers, and we showed how making use of a series of channels. So for example, just a set collection of straws, or more technologically advanced 3D printed set of holy materials, these are able to break down the resolution limit. The physics is that we are using Fabry-Perot resonances to amplify the evanescent wave components, and that's why that's how we are able to extract certain information that was not available in the raw signal itself. So we were able to show resolution down to lambda by 5 first, and later, we have shown resolutions down to lambda by 25. By improving by optimizing these parameters, again, just like Himanshu was talking about, trying to optimize these parameters. But because these are macro structured metamaterials, we use finite elements instead of more exotic simulation techniques. And by playing around with these properties of these lenses, so for example, by making use of porous materials, we've been able to show that we can break down the resolution even further. And this is the highest resolution reported worldwide for bulk ultrasonics, going all the way down to lambda by 36. Now, so starting off with bulk ultrasonics, I was saying that the resolution can be a few millimeters, guided ultrasonics few centimeters. With metamaterial ultrasonics, we today have the capability to go all the way down to few tens of microns, which is the best possible using ultrasonics. Now, where is this work going? So firstly, my PhD was in guided waves, so I was always interested in improving the resolution of guided wave inspection. Using metamaterials, we've been able to show that we can go all the way down to lambda by 72. So that's the best resolution reported in anywhere in ultrasonics across the world. Now, going forward, this work has taken on many dimensions, lots of exciting strands and threads, which I am going to cover very rapidly. So we've been looking at other ways of achieving a very similar physics. So one possible way is to use topographical lenses, or lenses that are achieved using geometrical contrasts, or also material contrasts equally well. So that's one line of work. The other very exciting line of work is to study the phenomena such as cloaking of sound, and using approaches such as transformation elasticity. So these approaches are similar to transformation optics that is used in the context of electromagnetic waves. So we can, for example, make an object invisible to sound. So that's another strand of work. We can use metamaterials to focus sound into solids. So using just a simple regular transducer, and for example, using a series of tubes, we've been able to show that we can focus sound into a material. So this could be useful in medical ultrasonics, where people want to focus sound at a particular point for achieving therapeutic applications. We have used metamaterials to suppress or improve or enhance certain higher harmonics in nonlinear ultrasound. So essentially, the metamaterial serves as a mechanical filter, for example. And we have also tried other types of enhancement. So for example, taking a cone and having a nano or micro scale hole at the top of the cone is able to also help us achieve submicron or sub-wavelength resolution as such. This is one of the most exciting applications of this metamaterial work, because seismic waves in the mantle of the earth are also elastic waves. And so we've been trying to extend our work to achieve seismic, to achieve damping of seismic disturbances. So this work is supported by the LIGO project, LIGO R&D India, where we are trying to develop a seismic metamaterial shield for protecting sensitive equipments that are being erected as part of the LIGO project. So now the work is further developing. We are in two areas. One, we are trying to microstructure these metamaterials to achieve those submicron resolutions that we have theoretically shown it's possible. And the other aspect is we are also working on concepts known as hyperlenses. So where hyperlenses help us to not just achieve magnification in of the amplitude, they are also helping us to achieve magnification spatially. So these could give us 10x or 15x or 100x magnification as well. So whereas in all using a micro metamaterial, I may have to use a receiver, which for example could be a laser Doppler vibrometer, but the spot size of the laser would have to be very small, in the range of few microns. And we have indeed acquired such a sub-micron focal spot laser, but this is expensive. I don't know if this can be very practicable. And that's why the hyperlens work is very exciting, because we can use a off-the-shelf transducer for the excitation, off-the-shelf transducer for reception, but achieve extraordinary resolution of features as such. This work is also taking us to the domain of heat. So as I was saying earlier, that sound and heat are very similar phenomena, except one is coherent, another is incoherent. So we are trying to work with thermal metamaterials as well. So this work is slowly gaining industrial traction. I've received a lot of agency funding. The industry is also starting to look at this. Now, here, I'd like to close on the other note. So I started off by saying we can improve resolution by two ways. Either we break down the resolution limit. So we go from lambda by 2 to lambda by x. But we cannot keep extending x to infinity. There is going to be some limitation, and the limitation is in the transduction. Ultimately, you require lasers with very low spot sizes and so on to receive even such kinds of signals. So the other option is then to go to very high frequencies. Can we achieve gigahertz range ultrasonic sources? So, but that will be limited by material noise. So that's the other problem, and I'll close on this note. So if we achieve hypersonics, that is sound in this frequency range, then we would have cut the resolution all the way down to few nanometers, and something like that has never been achieved with elastic waves. What are the challenges? The challenges are, if we go to such high frequencies, we're going to have noise in the source, and it is not easy to achieve such sources classically. So this is why I've been looking at going quantum. So that also brings us to the point that a true era of phononics perhaps will not start until we have a source of phonons, just like we have sources of electrons and photons for electronics and photonics. And this work could be attractive for quantum computing because phonons, because they are heat and sound, they can actually leverage waste heat, waste vibrations, and perhaps run in parallel to electromagnetic approach computing. And this could be, this could actually help us to deal with the Moore's law effect. On the other hand, something that's more interesting to me is, can we achieve ultra high precision sensing at great depths inside materials? And this is the promise of quantum hypersonics. Can we have entanglement enhanced phononic imaging? Now, where is this connecting back to metamaterials? So because now what we are talking about are meta atoms as such. So far I've spoken about macroscopic metamaterials. Now I'm talking about microscopic and nanoscopic metamaterials, and these are meta atoms. So how do we make meta atoms? So these are essentially nanostructured vibrators and resonators, and there are one of the challenges that we deal with is phonons, just like photons, can exist together in the same energy state. So unlike electrons, for example, which are fermionic particles, so we need ways to affect anti-bunching, or ways to make sure that only one phonon exists at a time. So there are now we have made some good progress on this as well. So here is an example of a meta atom. This is just like a quantum drum. So a drum that is scaled down all the way to nanoscale. And this work is continuing. And so this is the broad spectrum view of phononics. And if we do achieve quantum phononics, what are the implications? So we could image at great depths with resolution. We could perform computing and sensing by making use of waste heat and vibrations. And this work is also gaining traction. So of course, this is very early stage. So I showed you work which is at very high TRLs, and this is work which is at a discovery stage or fundamental stage, and hence low TRLs. So yeah, I'll stop at that point. I hope I am well in time, Professor Pradeep.
You're very much in time. You're, just under 19 minutes on way. So we have a lot of time for questions. Yeah. So what is the fundamental reason why you get to this lambda by 32 and the possibility of going beyond? And what is the limiting factor? Why this cannot be extended to other wavelengths?
Yeah, so essentially what happens is when a wave is scattered past a feature such as a defect, so in this slide, for example, so, the scattering happens at very high frequencies, essentially. So the feature will transmit past wavelengths that are much, much smaller compared to the incident wavelength. And at these wavelengths, the wave is highly attenuated, because that's why these are called evanescent waves, or waves that exist at very small distances from the source, essentially. So there are two ways to perform this imaging. You capture these evanescent waves directly, and then you can do imaging in synthetically. This is one line of work, and that's what has been done a lot, quite a lot in the literature. But the other thing is, the problem over there is that you will require a lot of signal processing, which is perhaps beyond a common practitioner. What we are trying to do is take the evanescent wave and then amplify it. So how the amplification happens here is through a Fabry-Perot resonator. A Fabry-Perot resonator is just like a channel. So like, sound being reflected from the two ends of the straw, for example. So when you have one round path, you have constructive interference. In this way, the wave is amplified, and this way actually the evanescent wave is amplified significantly, and we pick those components up. So we send at, say, for example, 1 megahertz, but our receiver is at 10 or 20 or 100 megahertz. And so what we wouldn't usually pick up, we pick up here. So that's how the resolution happens. And is that clear, Professor Pradeep, on the physics of this lambda by x?
Not quite clear. That you are picking up an evanescent wave, I understand. We are picking up closer, and as a result, you are enhancing resolution. I didn't quite understand. Closer meaning evanescent wave is picked up at a proximity.
And amplified. So think of a metamaterial as an acoustical lens. So let's say, let's look at the schematic. So the transmitter sends sound into a sample, and then the sound interacts with these two holes, which are defects, and then it is sent past. So in a normal circumstance, you will have a receiver on the other hand without a lens. So, and that receiver would be insensitive to any high frequency components because they're all dying out. Those smaller wavelengths are just dying out. They don't reach the receiver. Now, instead, what we are doing, we're putting a lens in, and this lens sort of selectively, by designing this lens carefully, we pick up these evanescent components and amplify them significantly, such that we are able to now receive and analyze them.
But how is evanescent wave enhancing resolution? Meaning, because you're talking about the two defects.
Yes.
Yeah. The distance between them. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. So those defects are actually deep subwavelength, and that means that they would not be visible. So let me talk another way. So any defect resolution is relative to the wavelength. So at lower wavelengths, let's say the distance between these two holes, let's say, is 1 millimeter, and my wavelength is 25 millimeter or 100 millimeter. the wave will just brush past these features and you will not be able to pick them up. It will be like a perturbation on the wave. On the other hand, if you actually sent a wave, that is, if the distance is 1 millimeter, you sent a wave with a wavelength at 1/10 of a millimeter, then these two features are going to scatter those waves extremely significantly. This is what we are doing. What we are trying to do is shift the imaging from low frequency to high frequency, so such that what was not visible starts to become visible to you.
So why not I use a infrared frequency, and then why not I see atoms?
Exactly. So those are the two strategies. Either we go very high frequency, but the problem with very high frequency is that the penetration inside material will be very low. Sound itself will not go in the material actually. So what we are doing is we are using low frequency, penetrating very deep into the solid, but picking up a component which would otherwise not be picked up.
But I can sit inside the matter and then generate waves from within. Why do I penetrate from outside? For example, infrared, if it were to be a resonator, it's an atom or a molecule will make vibrate.
But it can never go beyond a certain depth, isn't it, Professor? I mean, can you really penetrate a material which is 100 millimeter thick with infrared?
No, I'm saying that I will send in whatever frequency that I like, which penetrates, let's say X-rays, and then make the infrared out of this matter, and which will come out from two separate dots, and they are, let us say, they are at a very close proximity, and I see that with the infrared.
You're talking about electromagnetic waves.
Correct. So, I'm talking about X-rays.
Yes.
Let us say that goes inside.
Yeah.
And then it interacts with some 2 points which are at certain distance. With IR, I cannot see those distances.
Yes.
But these matter come, they come out. Infrared comes out of these. Infrared is coming out as a result of some process inside.
No, so when you send X-ray, actually, if you have a feature that is sub-wavelength to X-rays, you will never get infrared out of it, because infrared is much lower frequency compared to X-ray.
I'm talking about matter which converts X-rays into infrared because of some internal processes.
But
see, for example, there is some
but an aluminium, the practical inspection situation is such that we require to inspect aluminium, steel, composite, and so on. So we do not have a luxury of inspecting as an exotic sample like what you're saying.
Right. Yeah, very nice. Very nice. So this is going to right now. What is the limit now?
So we have shown lambda by 72, and I don't know what the limit is, but the limitation on the instrumentation is definitely, we are at the limit, because I have a laser receiver in my laboratory, whose spot size is half a micron, and that's the best resolution laser that is commercially available anywhere in the world. So perhaps lambda by 70 is the limit today, actually, because the receiver side limitations as such.
So is it possible for you then to, let us say a bone or fracture or something can be seen with ultrasound?
That's the goal, Professor. That's the dream. Yes.
Okay, very nice. Let's take other questions. I don't want to consume all the time. I think my colleague here, Sundar Gopal Ghosh, would like to see his carboranes with your technology, which is 1 nanometer.
I'm very scared of this mechanical thing. When you put a tag with the mechanical engineering with carborane, I get scared.
I think that's why these interactions help, because across domains we keep getting scared of each other.
So isn't there some interesting things that you can do with gas hydrates, Rajneesh? What do you think?
Yeah, I think, but the scale at which we would need would be like nanometer kind of, or so. We will have to talk. Maybe it's a good point. So you talk about in the fixed bed, basically. Yeah. So we are planning to do some hydrate analysis in the fixed bed, which is basically under the seabed and all. So Prabhu, I'll get in touch with you and then we will see if we can certainly utilize some of your expertise over there.
Sure. We'll be happy to. Yeah. Okay, so
Rajneesh is into real gas hydrates under the seabed. I mean, these are really macroscopic situations. You are anyway examining things underwater anyway.
Yes.
Yeah. We have used Raman spectroscopy to basically get the case distribution and how these gases are distributed in different cages. But your presentation is really eye-opening for me. So I'll certainly read a little bit more about your work and then maybe I'll get in touch with you.
Of course. Yeah.
Thank you. So I don't see other questions, Prabhu. It is quite promising, and the way that you are spreading out is so exciting. I'm sure that your plate is full.
Yeah, there's a lot of exciting directions, both in the macroscopic domain as well as in the micro and nanoscopic domain, and it's very exciting indeed, Professor Pradeep. Yeah.
So one thing is to see these things. Another thing is to examine their properties. I mean, this is what you're seeing is also properties. But what I'm trying to say is that when you are examining the strength of these materials, are there some kind of other insights that you are getting about material? For example, you look at a bridge, for example.
You look at Professor?
A bridge.
Yeah.
A bridge.
Yeah.
A concrete structure.
Yeah.
Are you seeing something more?
Yeah. So in a concrete structure, for example, what they want is strength typically, and that strength is correlated with wave velocity. So what we do is we send sound across the bridge, and then we measure the wave velocity in transmission. And if the wave velocity is 4,000 or 3,000 meters per second, for example, there are lookup tables by which we can predict the strength of the cement and whether it is set properly or
I was coming to something else. That is, you are seeing the cement, you are seeing the concrete, but you are also developing a crack. That is what your resolution is going to tell us about. And the crack is because of some chemical changes, some minor things, some impurities, defects, whatever. Is there some greater insights there?
So with ultrasonics and in general with diagnostic tools, there are two approaches to look at it. One is a macroscopic overall approach where you say property and its degradation. And the second thing is a microscopic approach where you're looking at cracks, we're looking at delamination and so on. So indeed, a lot of insight is possible. So if, for example, if a region is infested with cracks, surely there is something happening in terms of fatigue behavior, creep behavior that is very unusual. So not all cracks are cause for alarm, because any material will have cracks inside. But if the cracks are a lot, and if they are above a certain threshold, then there are other things to be inferred for the structure, for sure.
Thank you. Thank you. Let us close this meeting for the day and this month, and we'll meet all of you next month with more exciting talks.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Professor.
Thank you very much.
Bye.
Thank you,
Good one.
Very nice.
Bye, guys.
Thank you. Yeah. Bye.
Good night, everyone.
Good night.